It's August, yay. I'm Kurt Couchman. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at Defense Priorities. Before this, I was on the House side for 6 years. We're going to talk about Syria today. You know, it's not the most uplifting story. Here's where it is. This one. Okay, that's supposed to have a Google map that shows you where Syria is in the world. Don't worry, there'll be more maps, so we'll get to it. But, you know, once upon a time, Damascus was actually the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, which stretched all the way from parts of France and almost all of the Iberian Peninsula, all the way deep through Persia and beyond. So that was what Damascus once was. And then with the Civil War, obviously things didn't go so well. But backing up a little bit, sorry, that really threw me off. Before this, though, remember Saul of Tarsus, the guy who wrote half of the books of the New Testament? You know, he had his conversion on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus. Huge Christian population in the region historically. Still about 10% of Syrians are Christians of one kind or another. It goes all the way back to the first century there. I won't try to give you the full history, so now I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, so here's about a year and a half ago. This is in the middle of the Civil War. The government was limited to that sort of orangish, reddish area. You've got ISIS, you've got the Kurds, you've got other folks. The situation changed a lot. This is about a month and a half ago. The red is Syria's government, and then you can see the other areas being taken under control. This is the most recent map I found. There's not a whole lot of resistance. That blue bit down there, by the way, is the Golan Heights, which Israel has held for a while. But, you know, in 2011, the Civil War broke out. It was partly related to the Arab Spring. Assad's reaction kind of added fuel to the fire. It was sort of like his governance, totally inept. And then that raged for a couple of years. In 2014, you have ISIS arising from the dispossessed Sunni regions, not only in Syria, but also in Iraq. Russia came to Syria's aid, or really Assad's aid, in 2015. Iran's been involved for a very long time. Turkey is invested, especially because of the Kurds, but they have other interests in the region. Today, you know, ISIS is mostly defeated. It's that little gray bit right on the border with Iraq along the river. But there's other rivalries, other entities that have sort of come back to the forefront, and they're going to get way into this, so I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but I think we should step back a little bit. Assad was thought to be a reformer when he took power in 2000. If you read the articles from around that time, they're talking about how he was going to westernize Syria and make it a free and prosperous and inclusive place, and you know, that just didn't happen. Assad, I mean, part of it came from the Iraq mission in 2003. Assad tried to stop it. Syria had a rotating seat on the UN Security Council, so he tried to block it. Ultimately, obviously, it didn't succeed, but that started to poison some of the relations. Of course, we had sanctioned Syria for a time before that under state sponsorship of terrorism reasons, but we sort of increased the pressure over time. As I said, Assad's fairly inept at governing, has been his entire time. He was actually trained as an eye doctor, so didn't really have the deep background in how to be a political leader. Where do you want to be on this? This is the World Bank's Doing Business report. You want to be up at the top, and the U.S., for example, is mostly up there at the top, but Assad is, well, Syria under Assad is mostly at the bottom, so he's not doing a very good job in terms of creating conditions for prosperity. Now, Trump's national security strategy calls for technical assistance to anyone who wants it. Obviously, we haven't been giving that to the Syrians. Who knows if it would have made any kind of a difference, but it's an interesting thought experiment. So we're going to have today, we have Ben Friedman and Danny Sjursen. They're going to be our presenters. You have their bios at your seats, or if you didn't have one on your seat, grab it from a nearby seat. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to tell you what we're going to say, and then afterwards say what we said. Ben's going to talk a little bit about what our interests are in the region and whether they justify any sort of a military presence on our part. And then Danny and Sjursen is going to talk about how even if we wanted to, there are limits to what we can actually accomplish given the political dynamics here and also the political and social dynamics on the ground there. We're going to record the opening bit here, and then we're going to do Q&A, and we'll turn off the camera at that point so you guys can feel free to ask whatever is on your mind. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Friedman.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. The point I want to make today is basically that there were three emerging factors in Syria that should compel us to get our 2,000 troops out of there once ISIS is totally defeated. And those three factors that should compel our withdrawal are, besides the fact that there's no congressional authorization for war there, which is another matter. To summarize these points up front, the near defeat of ISIS achieves the main goal that our intervention, which began in 2014, serves. Secondly, Assad is winning, and his success undercuts the possibility of U.S. troops achieving some of the secondary tasks that our leaders in the last two administrations have occasionally assigned to them, helping overthrow Assad, ejecting or combating Iran, removing chemical weapons, and so forth. Third, the possibility of getting into a disastrous clash with one of the other powers there, whether it's the Assad regime, Iran and its proxy militias, Russia and even Turkey, is growing. And that risk, I think, is not worth the pursuit of whatever secondary goals we'd be pursuing subsequent to the defeat of ISIS. And that escalation point, the dangers of keeping troops there, is something I'll leave largely to Danny, but I'll make a couple of points on that. One thing the last two presidents seemingly agreed on is that the point of having troops in Syria was to eradicate ISIS, not engage in some grander nation-building mission or some grander balancing mission against the rival powers there. That's a task that's nearly accomplished in the conventional sense. ISIS's caliphate, as you can see, or as Kurt showed from the maps, which once covered large swaths of Syria and Iraq, is reduced essentially to a pocket of territory, a few hundred square kilometers along the Iraqi border, which is largely desert that constitutes about 1 or 2% of the territory ISIS once held. They're down, it's a little hard to say, but they're down apparently to about 1,000 to 1,500 fighters who are largely cut off from outside support, including new men, and seem not likely to be with us that much longer unless they surrender. Their territory, they had territory in southwest Syria near the border with Jordan. That's basically been destroyed. Jordanian troops say they killed several ISIS fighters in firefights last week who were essentially being chased across the border by Syrian troops. And so ISIS is on the ropes. Of course, its territorial defeat won't completely eradicate it as an underground insurgency or a terrorist organization. But I don't think that's a problem that 2,000 U.S. troops in eastern Syria are well equipped to deal with. Underground ISIS movement, or a clandestine terrorist organization as opposed to one that has an address, will presumably not position itself in places within Syria where it's easily accessible by U.S. ground forces. And we should know from experience that the presence of U.S. ground forces tends to exacerbate support for extremists, including terrorists. Luckily, I think ISIS's chief talent has been for making enemies, and the other powers that are in Syria and Iraq have a fair amount of motivation, as much as us, I would say, to go after ISIS as an insurgent or terrorist organization, absent the U.S. troops there. So it's not that they won't continue to bomb things as they did recently in southern Syria. It's just that other forces, certainly the regime forces, can deal with that better probably than we can, and staying there in search of a silver bullet for a long jihadist insurgency is not worthwhile. Let's also keep in mind that the withdrawal of U.S. ground forces won't mean the total absence of some strike capability and some intelligence gathering capability in case we want to do a limited raid or something, or a drone strike even, which should be authorized by Congress. So that's the first point. ISIS is on the ropes, and that was the main goal we were there to achieve. Within a month or two, that should be completely, ISIS should be completely eradicated. Second point, Assad is winning. The Assad regime was never on the brink of collapse, contrary to a lot of DC commentary, and there was never a coherent alternative among Syria's fractious rebel groups. So I think we should dispense with something that's become almost conventional wisdom, saying that our failure to more forcefully back the rebels in 2012 allowed the Assad regime to survive. I don't think there's much evidence for that. And even if it were true that we could have helped overthrow the regime, the likely result would have been a chaos sort of similar only to Libya, but on steroids because of the greater amount of population density in Syria. That is short of a full U.S. invasion, maybe, which I don't think anybody wanted for sensible reasons. The regime's recent advance into southern Syria, so they've gone down into the south there on the border with the Golan Heights and Jordan. That advance, which has been aided by Iranian advisors, by Hezbollah and other Shiite militias, and particularly by Russian air power, has it now in control of the whole southeast corner of Syria for the first time in 7 years. The rebels who survived there are negotiating reconciliation agreements, which is really a form of surrender, or some of them have been bussed to the northeast where there's still resistance through these agreements that allow them to do that. So that means with that advance, the regime has taken back 3 out of 4 of these de-escalation zones, which were pockets of rebels or rebel-held areas that through Russian negotiations, the regime agreed to sort of half leave alone for a while. And that was probably a cynical move on Russia's behalf because the regime, when it was ready, attacked those areas. But be that as it may, now 3 out of 4 of them are gone. And the one that remains in Idlib province in the northeast is up there where you can see the colored region in the top left of Syria. That's home to more than 70,000, maybe, according to some estimates, armed fighters who belong to a hodgepodge of groups. The most powerful and important group is the jihadi group called, it's an acronym HTS. Those guys are still there and will probably fight to the death. But there are more moderate Islamist forces that have been organized loosely by Turkey into the national, the Islamist forces have been organized into the Syrian Liberation Front, and the more moderate people who are the Free Syrian Army have been organized by Turkey into the National Liberation Front. So they're sort of umbrella movements. And then there's Turkey-backed militias who operate around there too. So you have basically a whole group, 4 different categories of rebel groups up there in the northeast who the regime has yet to deal with, but they say they will. They've said, Assad has said that they're going to take back that territory, and the Syrian army has begun moving forces up there in preparation to do that. That's problematic. Russia says it might not support that, although I think when push comes to shove, they will. And the real trouble in the northeast for the Syrian regime, besides the fact that there are 3 million people crammed in that corner of the country, which is going to make for a humanitarian disaster and a difficult fighting even if you don't care about humanitarian conditions. The real problem is Turkey. Turkey says that it's a red line for them. If Syrian forces enter that area, they have, as part of the de-escalation agreement, they have 12 posts, observation posts, which are, at the moment would be in the line of fire. So for the Syrian regime to do what it says it's going to do and go up there and retake that last corner of the country, or the second to last corner of the country, excluding the east, they're going to have to overcome the Turks. I think, however, they can do it. The reason they can do it is because Turkey seems pragmatic enough under Erdogan when it's done shouting and being difficult to cut deals, particularly with Russia. The Turks, the Russians, and the Iranians are engaged in a diplomatic process where they've been cutting these deals. And I think if the Turks can get what they want out of the Assad regime, they will basically abandon the rebels that they've been back, or at least negotiate a way for them to exit or surrender. And what they want is to get the Kurds off their border. They don't want there to be a Kurdish statelet on the Syrian border. And I would imagine that the Assad regime is prepared to offer that in part of the negotiation with the Turks. So within the next year, I think we'll probably see some sort of deal cut between the regime and the Turks that allows the retaking of a lot of that territory. You'll see these HTS jihadis maybe fight to the death, and a huge humanitarian disaster likely because of the few million people that are in that area, which will create a new refugee flow and all the problems that come with that. But in the end, I think the Assad regime is going to win. And then in the east, it's not marked on the map, but you have the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, who are essentially Kurds, who control roughly a third of the country. They have never been completely and utterly opposed to the Assad regime. Their focus has been attacking ISIS, and they've now entered into diplomatic talks with the Assad regime in Damascus, which will lead to some sort of, one imagines, the goal at least is to create some sort of deal where they get to keep some amount of power, but sort of full autonomy. The challenge for Assad, the Assad regime, will be to satisfy the Kurds, such that they let the government run that area again, and satisfy the Turks at the same time. But for all that complexity, I think the end state of the war is becoming clear. The parties who are standing in the Assad regime's way, for the most part, are negotiating the peace. There's really no more viable alternative in terms of the forces on the ground to Assad. So the regime's progress in these areas undercuts the various hopes that we've had, different policymakers have had for our intervention. Of course, there's been the hope that we would somehow overthrow the Assad regime or help give sufficient help to rebels such that they could. That's out the window. I think it's become completely unrealistic. But there's a number of other possible goals, and it was 7 months, going on 7 years ago, when Rex Tillerson was Secretary of State, that he laid out 5 goals for keeping U.S. forces in Syria, regardless of what happens of ISIS. One was to ensure that ISIS and al-Qaeda would never reemerge. The second one was to support the UN-led peace process. Then third, making sure the country is free of weapons of mass destruction. Fourth, allowing refugee return. And then fifth, diminishing Iranian influence. And I think for a lot of people, there's a sixth unstated one, which is that Russian influence in Syria. So depending on what emerge or re-emerge means, the first goal, preventing the re-emergence of ISIS, is either impossible or it's achieved, because it's very difficult to prevent in perpetuity the re-emergence of something, especially if you define it down into a terrorist organization that occasionally does things. But as I say, I think we've largely achieved that goal, and to the extent we haven't, it can be achieved by the forces that are there besides the United States. The next 3 goals, peace process, WMD, and refugees, I would summarize basically all as the United States wants to have 2,000 troops there, according to Rex Tillerson and the other people in the Trump administration who agree with him, have 2,000 troops there to keep leverage for peace talks. So the WMD and refugee things are not things that the troops there themselves can accomplish. It's something you accomplish through negotiation, which in theory the troops help you with. And I do think there's something to that, in that, number one, the goals, I think particularly refugee return and peace process that creates decent outcomes for people, period, and also people that the United States supported is a sensible, or at least laudable goal. And you have more leverage with 2,000 people, 2,000 troops on the ground than you do without it. But that said, I think the difference with having the troops there or not is a little leverage versus a little less. Our leverage is very limited by the rival powers who control, or at least along with the Assad regime, control most of Syria, by the limited ambit of our forces. So it's not like we can go around looking for WMD. Most of the chemical, we're really talking about chemical weapons, and the chemical weapons stockpiles are in the area our troops are in. And we can't ensure, those troops can't do much to ensure refugee return, which is in the populated parts of Syria that we're not in. So it's about leverage. And what leverage we have is really based on our power to intervene, on our power to bomb, on our power to give money to some other rebel groups. And those possibilities remain even if we take out the 2,000 troops. So I think, yeah, we lose a little leverage if we pull out those troops diplomatically, but I think it's worth it given the risk that I'll talk about in a second, that Danny will talk about, that those troops entail. by the way, we can amplify our diplomatic demands by working with Russia, as unpleasant as it may be. The Russians want us to work with them on refugee return. We should do that. We should try to use the leverage we have to ensure decent conditions, to ensure that people that we supported and other civilians in Syria are not slaughtered by the regime. We should make limited but sensible demands of that sort and pull out our troops. The reason I think that the added minor gain in leverage we get from having those troops isn't worth it is because there's a huge risk of escalation or stumbling into a war that we should avoid. And the troops there are sort of the tripwire that make that more likely. Let's say you think it's a great idea to combat Iran in Syria. I don't, for reasons I'll get into. But the regime's success makes that very difficult. The regime has invited Syria and Hezbollah and these other forces to help it, and they've done so. So it's very difficult to imagine that the regime, now having succeeded, will throw those people out on an abrupt schedule dictated by the United States just because we've got 2,000 troops in the eastern part of the country. Besides that, I think even if you want to have a sort of a proxy fight with Iran in the region, or a sort of neo-Cold War with Iran, which I don't think is a good idea, Syria is a terrible place to do it. It's in Iran's backyard. As I say, they're ensconced there by invitation. We're there by substantially less permission, and we're a lot further from home and in unfamiliar territory. So it's sort of the worst place you can imagine to have a kind of proxy fight with Iran, and I'm not even sure what that would entail in practice. I think what we ought to worry about vis-a-vis Iran is that it's because it has some long-range weapons there, and its forces, along with the Syrian regime forces, have moved close to the Israeli border. The Israelis are getting angry and attacking Iranian positions, or at least their militia, associated militia positions. And the trouble with that is not that Israel can't defend itself. I think it can, but rather that we might get pulled into a war for a whole bunch of reasons if Israel and Iran's fight escalates. And I think there's really nothing for us to gain from a fight of that sort, and we should do something about it. And I think what we can do about it is work with the Russians, who have said to the Israelis, look, we'll ensure that the Iranians pull back 100 kilometers from your border, and we can also try to insist that the Iranians and their forces don't have any long-range weapons. I think those are imminently achievable goals, and we can pressure the Israelis to go along with that, which they haven't at this point. We've said only complete Iranian withdrawal is sensible. And I think the United States doesn't have to completely parrot that line. We can have a little window of difference and say, well, let's be a little bit more realistic about what's possible here. As for combating Russia in Syria, I think it's a bad idea, not only because of the escalation dangers, but if Russia wants to be heavily involved in Syria to help Assad finish off Islamist insurgencies, we should be glad that they're doing it, not us. I think we've had substantial, unhappy, tragic experience with that kind of adventure in that region, and if somebody else wants to pay the unfortunate cost of it, why not let them? I don't think Russia is gaining any strength through having an adventure in Syria any more than any other distant power would. And so really, if you don't like Russia, you should welcome its sort of participation in civil wars in that part of the world. Besides that, I'll conclude by saying something about realism, the ism that we at Defense Priorities promote, and how one applies it in this situation in general. Realism, or realpolitik, which is sort of the implied version, is all about recognizing trade-offs, often tragic trade-offs in international politics, to choose between competing goods, to choose between promoting democracy, between economy, in other words, saving money, between stability, and between humanitarian ends. Making those choices is maybe unfamiliar because so many people around Washington say you never have to choose. Whatever I'm promoting is conducive to democracy, stability, the service of American interests, humanitarian outcomes. And whenever somebody says something to you that you don't have to sacrifice anything for what they're telling you, you shouldn't believe them, especially in international politics. It's never true. Syria's war was never going to have a happy ending, even if we could have overthrown Assad or helped people do so. There was never, as I said, a viable alternative to preserve a functional country, let alone a liberal one. So you overthrow Assad, you create a sort of a liberal chaos that's not conducive to U.S. values any more than I think the Assad regime is. From everything we know about liberalism and political order, Syria has always seemed quite unlikely to become any kind of democracy and prone to violent disorder, particularly if you remove the coercive structure that runs it. Right? If that doesn't make sense to you, think about what we did in Iraq, think about what we did in Libya. We essentially just unleashed chaos in the name of democracy or stability or something else that has not served those ends. So it's not a nice thing to tolerate or bet the restoration of the full rule of a despotic ruler, particularly one who uses chemical weapons against his people. And I think as Americans, we're sort of accustomed to avoiding those kinds of trade-offs. The real choice, I think, there is between a kind of ugly despotism that Assad will bring and chaos conducive to various ills, including a haven from terrorism. So to conclude, if you don't like that kind of choice, you shouldn't want to run the world, or at least have a foreign policy that involves meddling off in the Middle East.
Hello, I'm going to start today with my standard DoD disclaimer. I served as a Major in the United States Army for about 90 more days before my retirement. So what I'm about to say is my own opinion in an unofficial capacity. It does not speak for the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, or any other organization that probably disagrees with me. My view today is somewhat unique. I come at this as both a soldier and a wannabe scholar. My goal is to avoid repeating Ben's great comments, but to just give sort of a military officer's perspective on the problematic nature of America's current commitment to Syria and my fears for the future. Just a little bit about me, because probably no one has read the packet. I'm from New York City originally, from Staten Island, where everyone is either a cop, a fireman, or a drug dealer. I chose the Army instead. I went to West Point and graduated in 2001. I have a master's in history, and I'm working on a dissertation for my PhD as well. I have been in the Army for 17 years, in which I've moved 11 times. I joined in July of 2001, 2 months before September 11th, with no idea that I would see combat, and certainly no conception of the fact that I'd be at war for the greater part of 2 decades. I was in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan as a reconnaissance officer. I was there during both surges, the Iraq surge of 06-07 and the Afghan surge under Obama in 2011 and 12. After Afghanistan, I got my master's and I taught history at West Point, which was a very eye-opening experience. That was my last assignment until recently. I'm somewhat rare in that I am a military skeptic of U.S. foreign policy, and that I espouse realism in the vein of defense priorities goals as a military officer and soon as a retired military officer. The last thing I want to do to you is read the 16-page report that you all have emailed to you or have in front of you. Rather, I want to keep it kind of loose, hit a few key points, and then open it up so we can actually get questions. Because all of you who've been to events like this know we always run over, questions get short, fall. Syria is unique and complex. But when I view the Syrian war, or any U.S. military intervention, especially in the Middle East, I do so through the lens of my own experience with failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a hard thing to accept, failure in a war you fought in. Frankly, I also see it through the chaos we unleashed in Libya. I was not in Libya, but I have watched the outgrowth of that and the chaos unleashed. We have to ask ourselves a question that I've had to ask myself personally, but we in the public sector have to think about all the time, which is, how do we have a conversation with a mother or a spouse to explain why a soldier was killed in combat? I've done it in Iraq, I've done it in Afghanistan. People are having to do this again in Syria. What are we fighting and dying for? And let's hope the reasons are worthy. My reason for concern overall is that too many policymakers on both sides of the aisle talk about the desire for regime change in Syria. It's still common to say we want Assad to go, but we have neither the capacity nor the leverage for that, as Ben so aptly laid out. Even if we did, I'm here to tell you that regime change has a poor record these last 2 decades. Regime change under either George W. Bush or Barack Obama fell into one of generally 2 models. Model 1 was Iraq. Massive use of American military force, long-term occupation, trillions in dollars, and thousands of lives, American and even more Iraqis, in blood. Attempts at nation building and long-term quagmire that, well, we're still there, aren't we? Trying to prop up regimes that are only marginally legitimate and rather chaotic. What Barack Obama came to office, he was going to save us, right? Because his model for regime change was Model 2. We won't send 120,000 soldiers to Libya, but we'll use airstrikes, alliances with various militias on the ground, and we will lead from behind to overthrow the Libyan regime. So in many ways, Model 2 has almost nothing in common with Model 1, and yet the outcome was equally chaotic. The outcome was chaos on the ground, a division of space into little statelets run by warlords, and an Al-Qaeda and eventually IS, Islamic State, presence in Libya. What makes me scared is that Syria presents a really dangerous hybrid between the two models. In Syria, we neither have the ground forces and leverage that we had in Iraq, nor do we have the ally backing that we had in Libya. The fear is that without leverage and without very many forces on the ground, 2,000 soldiers can only do so much. We had 160,000 in Iraq, and that didn't turn out particularly well. We may end up with both chaos and the lack of American leverage in a situation where other parties, Iran, Russia, for example, and Turkey, have more power. Okay, so the 5 big takeaways that I really want to get at today is 1, the U.S. has only limited strategic interests in Syria, combating transnational terror and avoiding great power conflict with nuclear-armed Russia. With the Islamic State almost completely erased as a physical caliphate, the U.S. has achieved all it reasonably can, already in Syria. Number 2, the facts on the ground dictate that Assad's regime, no matter how nefarious, when backed by its Russian and Iranian partners, will achieve victory in Syria. It already controls the portion of the country, the western portion, which has almost all the population. And the U.S. currently lacks either the will, the capacity, or the profound national interest to meaningfully alter that outcome. Syria is a veritable trap, as I've called it in the past, that is almost all risk with almost no reward. With combat aircraft, military personnel, allied proxies, and various mercenaries, as we've seen, in close proximity, the risk of a dangerous escalation with either Russia, Iran, Assad, or even our NATO ally Turkey is rather high, far too high. Number 4, another risk of long-term military occupation, which I've been a part of. In eastern Syria, it has the potential for mission creep, the tendency for stabilization and security tasks to multiply as the U.S. military forces are progressively seen as responsible for post-war nation building. Do we really want to conduct another nation-building exercise in the Middle East, this time in Syria? And finally, recent military adventures demonstrate that the lengthy presence of Western soldiers occupying a Middle East locale rapidly produce a counter-reaction. And that counter-reaction from the people tends to be a nationalist/Islamist hybrid insurgency. We are the proud owners of approximately 1/3 of Syria today. If we are still the proud owners of 1/3 of Syria next year, I would not be surprised if we are fighting a new insurgency that is nationally inspired. So now for the uncomfortable part, and the questions that I expect to get, that I hope to answer sort of up front. Assad is a monster. There is no doubt about that. But Assad provided a degree of stability in Syria. Assad protects minorities, including the 10% of Christians that were in the region. Assad's poor governance certainly caused the civil war, and that's not to be questioned. But I'm worried about what comes after Assad. What does Assad 2.0 look like? Assad is also containable in Syria. There's very little likelihood that he has regional aspirations of conquering other countries. And number 4, though it's sad, is that Assad, with Russian and Iranian backing, is not going anywhere anytime soon. Let's think about the risk-reward calculus. Risk number 1, an an escalation of conflict or an outbreak of conflict with Russia or Iran. If we back up a couple of slides and show the current breakdown of who controls what, you see a standoff here between the yellow Kurdish portion, that's the proud part of Syria that we are currently occupying, or at least providing help with the occupation. You notice that there's a very jagged line. That's the Euphrates River, and the Euphrates River divides the United States from both the Assad forces, the Iranians, and also the Russians. And it reminds me a whole lot of Berlin during the Cold War. One false move, and we could have a major outbreak of conflict with a regional nuclear power. Not too long ago, a few months back, up to 200 Russian mercenaries were killed when they crossed into the de-escalation zone that has been established, and were killed by U.S. airstrikes. Thank God they were mercenaries. Thank God Putin decided to take a prudent response and a cautious response. But what happens when it's a Russian plane that gets shot down? What happens when it's an American Special Forces team that takes casualties on the border? Ben mentioned Turkey and the Kurds. Turkey has warned us that they will never accept a Kurdish enclave or a Kurdish statelet on their south and east border. They've threatened us in places like Afrin and Manbij to stay out of their way. And this is really concerning because NATO has lots of different military forces, but the second largest army in NATO is Turkey's. Do we want a conflict with a NATO ally? Turkey in this instance. A nation that has nuclear armed bases for the United States. A place where they provide the platform for any military capability we do have. This seems dangerous to me. Another risk is that insurgency breaks out. I've already talked about that. No one likes to be occupied. And the presence of foreign Christian forces in Sunni Arab lands in the east of Syria is unlikely over the long term to be welcomed, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. The rebels are not quite as moderate as we had hoped, at least not year 7 in this civil war. The sad reality is that Al-Nusra Front, which has been renamed as basically an Al-Qaeda franchise, is allied with many of our, quote, allies in the rebel areas who Assad is fighting. Which brings us back to the point that we don't know what will replace Assad, but we can be sure it probably won't be any more friendly than what we have. So again, as a soldier's view, I fear mission creep. I fear that 2,000 soldiers in Syria becomes 20,000, or that 1 year in Syria becomes 15 years, as we enter the 18th year of war in Afghanistan. And the first time in American history that a child will graduate high school and join the army having been born after 9/11. You need to think about the effects on a republic when that becomes the case. There is no exit strategy. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we ended up stuck in a place that we never intended to be stuck in for 17 years in one case, 14 in another. I saw it firsthand, and no matter how much you love your soldiers and support them, we have to be very careful that we give them missions that are achievable and that are possible and have clear outcomes and clear exit strategy. 2,000 troops is not enough to change the outcome in Syria. But I will tell you, it is just enough to risk a major war or occupation. So it is really easy to critique policy, and I do it all the time, without providing an alternative. It's going to be complicated, but I would surmise an alternative strategy, and that would be offshore balancing. Prior to 9/11, the United States had plenty of military forces in the region of the Middle East, but tended not to directly involve its combat troops in the maelstroms and instability of the region. Rather, we provided the ability to project force if necessary against terror threats or react to regional aggression like we did in the Gulf War. Why can't we go back to that? Some version of containment of the real problem in the Middle East, which is transnational terror, which has largely been defeated in Syria and certainly could be reacted to again in the future. Keeping soldiers in the Middle East offshore allows us platforms for counterterrorism without getting stuck indefinitely in Syria. Remember, there are only two vital strategic interests in Syria. Number one, transnational terror. Think ISIS, think Al-Qaeda. The caliphate physically has been erased to about 1 to 2% of its current size, and the Al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra is probably going to be stamped out by Assad. They will likely stay in place as an underground terrorist organization, but an offshore balancing role will allow us to work with local partners to stifle these threats when necessary. Second is major power conflict with Russia or Iran. We don't need this. And offshore balancing will achieve both of our major objectives while still lowering the risk and commitment from the U.S. I'm going to probably hear some common critiques, and that is well that people are thinking critically. Number one, people will say, but isn't Assad awful? Yes, Assad is a bad guy, but who shall replace him? Sunni extremists and the rebel movements? Besides, Assad has already won, unless we commit tens of thousands of troops and risk a war with Russia to make it otherwise. Others will say, if the United States wins or leaves, is that not a win for Russia? Is that not a win for Iran? Well, the reality is that Iran and Russia have always had a stronger relationship and more of an interest in Syria than we do. They've always been there. The Russians have a military base at Tartus on the Mediterranean. They're providing armed support to Syria since the middle of the Cold War. So we're not giving them a country that used to be in our sphere. We're accepting the fact this has already been in their sphere, and quite frankly, they can deal with the outcomes of this civil war, which I assure you will be messy. Iran and Russia are not natural allies. Why should we want to push them together, which we seem to be doing? There is a long history of military conflict and border disputes between the Russians and the Iranians. It is American policy in the Middle East that largely pushes them together. We should be looking to divide those two countries where possible. People will ask about Israel, and I'm happy to talk about that. We want good relations with Israel, but so does Russia. Russia is not comfortable with a war between Iran and Israel. Netanyahu visited Moscow. They want close relations. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, of course have the right and the capability to defend themselves, but I am rather confident that Russia will restrain Iran in the southwest of Syria to avoid a major conflict in the vicinity of the Golan Heights between Israel and Iran. I promised I wouldn't be too long, and I think I'm right at my 15-minute mark. So some conclusions. My fear is that if we don't disentangle soon, then we will look back on Syria 2 decades hence and wonder how we got so bogged down in Syria. Even after the lessons of Iraq, of Afghanistan, and Libya, we will look back and wonder how could we have not learned our lesson and gotten ourselves into something similar in Syria. Finally, remember that disentangling is not appeasement. It is not isolationism. It is prudent strategy, which has been lacking across many administrations for many years since 9/11. When we think on Syria and the whole of the Middle East, think of the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. First, do no harm. So, in the interest of doing no harm, for once in the Middle East, let us do less. Thank you.
All right, thank you.